now, and you should see a little pop-up on your screen just to consent to the recording. So I'll hand over to you then, Steve and Peter. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It is an absolute honor after attending so many of these wonderfully enlightening lunchtime conversations over the years at this point, Rob. It's an absolute honor to contribute to one from this side of the screen, so to speak, this side of the presentation. So, and I have to thank Peter for making time to be, first of all, a great collaborator on campus, but also making some time today. And he'll be joining me in a few minutes after I get through this just initial exposition a little bit on what the nature of our project here and what's kind of motivating us to kind of experiment in this space, like a lot of you probably are. But as we know here on most of our campuses, there's a lot of anxiety around this space, especially in the teaching and learning space, about both embracing change, but being kind of mindful and kind of conservative and really thinking about the long tail of what these partnerships and experiments are with large corporations that are integrating AI into the teaching and learning space. So this is what follows here is a thought about, kind of how to find some positive benefits for our lecturers and thinking less about kind of, all of the anxiety around threats to academic integrity and thinking, well, how can we empower some of our lecturers to experiment with some of these tools in a way that feels productive and gives them, hopefully some experience, kind of kicking the tires and really learning about both the affordances or the benefits and then the shortcomings of some of these technologies, and in a way that benefits their teaching and learning kind of capacities. So one experiment that we wanted to look at here was, and for those of you familiar with DCU's kind of campus infrastructure, we call Moodle Loop locally. That's how we've branded it and kind of established our identity around campus with Moodle. So we use those terms somewhat interchangeably. So if you see Loop and Moodle and have some confusion, that's what we're referring to. That's really just the same thing. So we wanted to kind of integrate a plugin that I'm going to just show you briefly to implement some features of genAI, specifically ChatGPT, to generate content in Moodle and understand the benefits and some of the limitations. What we wanted to do, we found this AI generator plugin in Moodle through some of Rob's great research, and we have configured the ChatGPT API subscription. We also wanted to support our lecturers here and kind of find some innovators and some people with a particularly experimental mindset around campus that might be interested from across the 5 faculties that we have at DCU to kind of roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty, so to speak, in experimenting and in a relatively controlled sandbox and a limited pilot. So we wanted to support those lectures, not only to experiment, but to also to critique the content that they would be receiving from ChatGPT, to create these quizzes and the quiz questions, and make sure that they felt like they had some clear support and guidelines by which to experiment. And then we wanted to evaluate those lectures' experience through an approved research study, which is currently underway. And Peter has generously contributed some of his insights to, as he will share shortly. So this, for those of us who are in the more tech and admin side of Moodle, you might be familiar with the plugin library, and there's a lot of really, really wonderful open source plugins and resources and basically a community of support around them. So for those of you, and maybe Rob, if you are able, maybe you can put this link in the chat, or I'll put it in the chat after I've handed over the screen. But this is the AI text-to-questions generator that we're going to be looking at here. It's very easy to find. It's it's a remarkably simple plugin. So here is what the admin panel looks like. It's very simple. We just kind of configure an API key, which version or which flavor of the GPT that we're going to be using, and then some basic defaults. And this is basically what the API side looks like with the usage activity. And they use what's called tokens to measure. It's not even words. Or even syllables. It's tokens represent about 4 characters. So that's the kind of unit of measurement by which OpenAI kind of quantifies exactly what's coming in and out of the generator. So once you have the generator configured, there's some styling that you can do, and I'm not going to get too in the weeds here, but basically what you see is this topic prompt. It's an open, just an open prompt here, and there are some additional supporting prompts kind of behind the scenes. If we have time, and that's a big if, I can show a little bit behind the scenes, but essentially from the lecturer's perspective, what they'll be inputting here is a topic, and this can be something that's as simple as like a 5 or 6 word construct. Here I've inputted a topic that's just simply ethical uses of artificial intelligence in assessment design, right? It can be a short and sweet prompt. A lot of us are getting used to prompt engineering and finding the right size and kind of tone of prompts to get what we want from them. But alternatively, there's a second way of using this topic that you can actually input, for instance, the text of an article, or you can copy and paste the text of your slides is another approach. And you can train the questions on topics of your, that are specific to your lectures. It takes about 90 seconds to return some questions. And, obviously we're encouraging lecturers to be very, very critical in terms of, not just taking everything that it gives you and rubber stamping that as valid and reliable for assessment design. But what we find is the quality is relatively high, and I'm actually going to get some of Peter's insight on that. But as we know, for those of us who use quizzes in Moodle, there's actually quite a few layers to the quiz itself. You've got the quiz, you've got the question bank. Within the question bank, you have the questions, right? Now, below the question, you have four choices in most MCQs, and then a layer below that, you have corrective feedback. And what we find is that the corrective feedback is actually quite well tailored generally, right? Generally, everything is taken with a grain of salt here, but for the most part, we found that the quality is really quite high, and even if it's with a little bit of editing, we find that it can save lecturers some time in kind of at least populating all those fields and then doing some tweaking. So second, we wanted to support these lecturers, so we did a big recruiting drive, and this is an ongoing process currently. So we are still, I'm having an info session later this week, as a matter of fact, for current lecturers that are still looking to experiment with this tool. We have a sandbox that's set up here with some guidance and some instructions, and then the kind of instructions to actually bring it out of the sandbox and use the generator within your own course question bank if you'd like. We are conducting some research, and so we wanted to make sure that we had all our ducks in a row to make sure that we had a good research design. We have an anonymous survey that we've deployed to all of our recruits that have been experimenting. And we're getting some great feedback. I'm not gonna be able to go into too deep of a level with you here, and this is why we have Peter here actually to get some of his brilliant insight. But what we've seen for the most part, the big trend is one in which lecturers say this saves them time, even in just kind of seeding questions that they can then kind of shape into something that's more appropriate and fit to purpose for their assessment. But this is the big thing about kind of saving time as an efficiency measure. And then second, also kind of creating a space for this conversation amongst lecturers and across faculties, and giving some institutional support as to kind of guiding the conversation about experimentation, because this happens in largely, I think we're finding it when we speak to groups outside of DCU, that there's a lot of kind of the nature of this conversation is largely unstructured around our campuses. So the feeling that there was kind of institutional support and people weren't operating in isolation is something that we found that lecturers also appreciate greatly. I have to at least foreground some of the limitations here while we're on this call to say that this is not a perfect one-size-fits-all solution. Text-only questions is really what's best fit for this. And because of the specific configuration, we can't, for instance, dump in images, audio, et cetera. So this really, in its current form, works best text only. So just to answer that question up front. And then, at the more institutional level, we also, of course, want to be critical about, kind of wholesale adoption of these tools, as I mentioned earlier. And we want to keep in mind in all of our conversations and considerations, notions of sustainability of these platforms as we bring them into our VLE ecosystems. And then also thinking about kind of the logistics, politically, institutionally, thinking about what it means to kind of invite, one of these large vendors into our teaching and learning space. So being really mindful about, the terms of the contracts, the data protection, et cetera, are very important and foremost in what we're thinking about. Any one of those could be a 20-minute conversation, but with no further ado, I want to kind of halt the exposition part there and introduce my great colleague and an invaluable resource around DCU, Peter Tiernan, who is joining us from the Institute of Education. And Peter, we already tested your mic and everything. I know you're here and able to hear us, but if you wanted to say hello to the crowd, we'll transition.
Of course, yeah. Hi, everybody, and lovely to see so many of you here. Hopefully, I can provide something of value or some insights into how I used it in my practice.
Great. So, Peter, maybe you could tell me a little bit about kind of, you received, this outreach, and what were your thoughts about what excited you about kind of experimenting with this tool, and maybe even how it kind of relates to the other kind of experience that you have using AI tools in your teaching and learning?
So my first thought really was it's connected to what you said at the start about a lot of the hyperbole around AI, and I just felt that it was a good opportunity to think about integrating AI in a very practical, pragmatic, but also staged manner. So not in a way that was going to take over practice, or not in a way that was going to interrupt the teaching and learning approach that I would be familiar with, or engagement with students, or relying on it in terms of content generation. I thought it was a nice way of exploring it in assessment without the fears around plagiarism. And a lot of the conversation around AI and assessment is around students' use of AI to create their work and generate their work. So that was what drew me to taking part in the study, was that pragmatic approach.
Great. And what once you started experimenting with the tool, maybe you can just say something about what worked well for you, and what surprised you, and what were some limitations.
Yeah, of course. So I think I was in week 2 or 3 of semester when the invite came through, or certainly by the time I got to chat to you, Steve. And I made a decision at that point that I would use it every week. So I met the students every week, and then I used the genAI to create a formative assessment after each lecture, and that was put up on Loop or on Moodle for the students to take. Now, I took a very open approach. So the module I was teaching at the time was on digital media and learning with post-prime or future post-primary teachers. And we'd already had a session on genAI and some of the challenges and opportunities that brings to education. So I explained to them that I was taking part in an experiment, a university-led experiment. And I explained to them that I would be using the genAI tool to create questions based on each week's topic. They could voluntarily take the quiz. It would not have any impact on them or me if they didn't take the quiz, but I would really value their input in terms of, do the questions make sense, the process, and any other qualitative comments that they might have. So I did this in a couple of ways. So for 1 or 2 of the weeks, like your example on screen, I simply put in a statement. So generate some questions on digital literacy, for example, digital literacy and digital competencies, and let the AI generate, I think it was 8 was the default, 8 questions. For 1 or 2 of the other examples, I exported my PowerPoint slides to Word, copied and pasted all the text from my PowerPoint slides, pasted it in the kind of additional information box to see would that have an impact on the questions that were generated. And in a third example, I took the transcript of a online Zoom lecture that I'd recorded and pasted the transcript into the second information box. I can't remember the name of it, Steve. And I was pleasantly surprised with the quality of the questions. Now, for each of them, I did have to review the questions, and there was somewhere I made some edits, mostly around slight grammatical things, just a localization, so how I might ask a question. But in the instances where I put in the text from the transcript from Zoom, and when I put in my slides, it did generate questions that were specifically based on the content that I had suggested, which was very positive.
Wow. I appreciate how structured you were and mindful of those 3 different kind of parallel experiments. What didn't work well? I know you just said you had some edits that you had to make. Was there anything else that kind of surprised you or disappointed you, or some clear limitations?
So I think like you highlighted some of them at the start, and maybe some of these are more around the impact, the final question, maybe that will go through the broader GenAI implications in education. So they were text-based. The interface, and this might be due to my lack of use of Moodle quizzes in general, but I found that a little clunky, the ins and outs of using that. And I was using it every week. And so you'd create a set of questions, they'd go into the bank, then you take questions out of the bank for this week. Some of that just felt a little clunky. But other than that, it was a very straightforward user experience. My overriding comment on a lot of this is that we need, as people working in education, to explore the impact and implications of GenAI in various different fields, and this is just a good opportunity to do that. So while some of the negatives or some of the things that can be improved, we won't know what we need to improve unless we explore and experiment with this stuff.
Great. And in the interest of time, I mean, I have a million questions. Of course, I could rattle on about any of the points that we're making. This is an ongoing pilot for those interested, and I will just give my some of our contact info. As I do that, Peter, I'm going to ask the last question before I turn over to Rob in the larger group, which is simply, is this a tool after your experiments? Is this a tool that you would feel comfortable kind of proposing or recommending for your colleagues?
So I suppose yes and no, and some of it's more of a pedagogical rather than a technical piece. So it was fast and efficient, and some of your quotes at the start, Steve, around that are true. I asked students to respond with their comments, and many of them emailed me and said, I couldn't tell whether this was created by you or an AI. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And certainly in a positive sense, it motivated me to include more regular formative assessment. Now, my question is, if the efficiency and speed would then discourage me from alternative ways of formative assessment. So I think AI does provide us with efficiencies, but if human nature is to hand off a task that you can hand off, I think we need to be reflective around when and why are we using AI. If we were going to do this task and AI will make it more efficient, fine. But if we are or if the encroachment of AI is forcing us into decisions, forcing is not the right word, but is encouraging us to make decisions for the wrong reasons, well, then I think that it poses challenges, not in the technology itself, but in the implementation of that technology.
Great. And I think that proves a really important point that none of these decisions can be made in isolation. So although it's a great tool, it's a great plugin, we always have to keep the larger picture in focus. Great. So I blabbed on at length up front there. So Rob, happy to turn it over, and I'll put my email in the chat, and please feel free to reach out with any questions.
To you.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Simon Hewitt. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University, and I'm going to be talking to you today about improving or strategies that I use to improve visual engagement through generative AI. I'm going to say generative AI because for some reason when I say Gen AI, it sticks in my mouth. So it's going to be always generative AI. So I think, is that working? Yeah. So the presentation, I'm going to offer some background context to the work that I was doing, talk you through the goal that I hope to achieve with it, the implementation, give you some examples, talk about ethics, run through what the outcomes were, and then offer my reflections. Rob mentioned there that all of this came about through a online book put together by colleagues at Trinity about using AI in generative AI in teaching, learning, and assessment. And I was asked to contribute mine because, I'm sure you've all been to many workshops. Whenever there's a workshop at Maynooth and it's about generative AI, I end up being there because I'm really interested by it. And I'm also terrified by it, as most of us are. And I think that kind of fits into the opening context, which is that and I say maybe most of us have experienced a departmental meeting or some other meeting where as soon as the term AI comes up, it just devolves into a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety around what this is going to mean for mostly around assessments. I think that's the one that really gets people the most. For us, though, in the media department, is we've got a kind of tension there because, yes, we're concerned about assessments, of course, but we're also really interested in it as a new technology. Like the stuff that I write about and research about is the impact of new technologies on the relationship between consumers and creators. So generative AI is like, that's my wheelhouse. Like, I'm really excited to learn about its uses. And so the idea of just having a blanket no Gen AI use within class policy doesn't really work for us, because we need to get our students talking about it, learning about it. And that's what we're doing within. So the two cohorts in which I'm experimenting with its use are the large first year undergraduate module, which right now is around 200 students. And I've got a postgraduate methods class. And indeed, this semester, I've got another third year class as well. I'm essentially doing the same things in all the classes. And I'll talk you through what they are. So what I've noticed is that, students within media studies do have perhaps an inclination towards generative AI, just by virtue of the fact that they're interested in media. Now, I began at least with that assumption that they would be excited by it, or as excited by it as I am. When I get to reflections, I'll talk through the fact that I was actually surprised that many of them have different opinions. But we also have the fact that most of the modules all of the modules on which I teach, all text-based content is entirely restricted. Like there's no generative AI to be used in any of the text-based. So what I wanted to do was give my students an example of, and I'll borrow the phrase that Steve used, which is to show how AI can move from threat to tool. Like I wanted to give them practical real world examples of, look, these are really useful tools, and this is how one can use them ethically and how one can use them in a way that can help the teaching and learning process. The aim was to incorporate Fiorella's idea of generative learning, which is the idea of like making sense of the learning content by organizing it in terms of existing knowledge, in terms of existing experience of the students. And I also wanted to boost visual engagements, both on the Moodle page and also in my in-class activities. And what I did two things. The first one is to create catchphrase. I basically ripped off catchphrase. For those of you who don't know the TV show Catchphrase, it's a visual pun. It's a visual pun based on something that then you guess. And I used generative AI, to create images that are in some way linked to the themes for that class that day. It's kind of a way of getting the conversation started in a fun way that the students can engage with. I also use it to generate icons for the Moodle page, to make the Moodle page a lot more visually accessible. And throughout all of that, I'm constantly informing students about my use of generative AI and giving them practical examples of how one cites it. I'm teaching a third year module at the moment, in which, while text is not allowed, generative AI text, they are allowed to generate images using AI. And I want them to be able to say, like, look, this is how you do it. This is an ethical way of using this tool. So I'll give you some examples. Actually, maybe I can get the chat up. Let's see if I can find the chat function on here, or maybe Rob, you can call it out. Essentially, I'm giving them catchphrase. So this was on a class around, I think it was around platformatization. And so this would be a visual pun based on a popular communication platform. Can anyone tell me what that communication platform is?
So Yvonne is suggesting Zoom?
Correct, Yvonne. It is indeed Zoom.
Oh, Yvonne.
There we go. And so the next one, this is on a popular film from the mid-2000s, maybe 2010s, around 2010.
Steve is going to guess this now. Steve has great movie knowledge. Oh, so Gillian, Simon, Catherine all saying The Social Network.
Oh, Martin, yes, The Social Network, The Social Network. Plenty of people there with The Social Network.
You were too slow there, Steve.
Yeah, and the last one. This is a TV show from the 90s. Or may have been late 90s, early 2000s.
Friends?
No, this is, I'll give you a clue. It's, I would say, slightly problematic in its representation. Not the show, I mean the AI generated image.
This is a tough one now, Simon.
This would be Gossip Girl. And what I find, first of all, it's getting people talking, which is useful, and you can see examples of that in the chat. It gets people engaged in the start of the class, and it has many benefits. Like, it's, for at least in media studies, you know, the first thing I do when they come in the class is say, hey, what have you all been consuming? You know, talk to me. And it gets them started and gets them comfortable with the idea of sharing in a big classroom environment. But it also helps me understand, like, what are these students, what are these predominantly young people consuming to keep me updated, so I can use examples throughout my class that are more relevant to them. And yeah, it kind of gets the conversation started, but it also tends to link to the theme of that week's class. And like, for example, this one, when we were talking around, I forget the class particularly, it might have been the gender performativity class, but I was looking at, like, I got them to talk about, okay, what does it mean that this, when I put in the word Gossip Girl, it produces images in pink. I got them to talk about the kind of problematic nature of AI generated images, and it really gets the conversation started. And there's a lot of benefits to that. So I also, one of the other huge benefits, I think, and it was mentioned in the I think by Peter in the last presentation around time saving, is that one of the things that I'm trying to do is instill principles of UDL. So I'm trying to make my presentations more accessible. And one of the things that I find tremendously time consuming is developing alt text for any images that I use. Now, you can use generative AI to develop alt text, so you can input the image and ask it to describe it. But when you've generated an image in this way, it will auto-generate alt text. So when you drag and drop into, or download and upload into PowerPoint, you'll have the alt text built in. And so for any students using screen readers, it will give, I mean, you label it as descriptive, as decorative, and it gives an alt text breakdown of what the image is. I find that really, really useful. And the other example of how I use it is I use it for my Moodle pages. So one of the things that I've noticed, and indeed one of the things that was fed back to me, was that Moodle pages can often be quite difficult to traverse. And I know that because, I mean, I'm on a contract here at Maynooth for a couple of years, but I've worked at many organizations. And when you're a hourly paid lecturer, you come in, the first thing you do, you're given the Moodle page and you're off and running. And I'm thinking, where is everything? You know, how do I find stuff? And if it's difficult for me to find, it's difficult for the students to find. So this was not my idea to use this system. This was, I think, Adeline Cooney, who's in our Centre for Teaching and Learning at Maynooth. I was doing a postgraduate certificate, and she, for her modules, organized it in this way. She didn't use generative AI images, but she did organize it using the grid format. And I instantly found it so much easier to traverse. So I kind of incorporated that with the AI generated images. So I just generate some images that are relevant to the themes for that week's class. It's a very simple process. I just tell it to generate some images based on an abstract representation of, and then I give the title of the lecture for that week. Some practical things to consider is I tell it to not use text, because when AI generated image, well, when it generates images, it tends to generate images with some of that text within the image. So I tell it to not do that because I don't want it to be like, it looks a bit messy essentially. And I also emphasize the ethical use. So this is on my Moodle page. When you go into module information, I have, this is highlighted here, the icons on this Moodle page were created on this date using which LLM I used and the exact prompt that I used. And indeed, when I do the opening catchphrase media exercise at the start of class, I also have that to remind them every time, you know, this is the way that you correctly cite, or at least this is the way that I think is a way to correctly cite AI generated images. Obviously, practices will vary, and new methods of best practice will develop over time. But that's what I'm trying to instill, that there is a way to use these tools in an ethical way, and this is hopefully one of the ways to do it. And I measured my feedback in the pretty standard ways. I do a end of semester module evaluation, but I also do a mid-module kind of informal feedback. It's just a box in the middle of the room with post-it notes. I leave the room for 5 minutes and just give students an opportunity to give their feedback. And a lot of them were really excited and really pleased with the idea of the catchphrase media game. They thought it encouraged participation, especially in the bigger classes. You know, you've got 200 students in a massive lecture theatre. It's not always easy for the ones who are, well, for any of them. I mean, especially if they're first years, they're coming into a big new environment. It's difficult for them to have that confidence to contribute. And so the fact that game kind of it's kind of fun and it gets them talking. And yeah, they were really positive about it. I've talked to other staff members, and I've given presentations in departmental meetings and shared some ideas that have been adopted on other modules as well. And I think ultimately the benefits is that it reflects the learner interest. So it's talking to them about the kind of media that they consume. And perhaps this is limited to media studies, or, you know, as a discipline specifically. I do think it has applications to others, but the fact that it is using a form of media to generate conversations about media is really useful for me. It also, and this is, I would say, for any discipline, it really helps users with to navigate the page. I've noticed that it's so much easier to use my phone. Like, Moodle is not the easiest thing when you've got drop downs on the phone, because it sort of, I can't articulate it, but it kind of, when you press the button, everything moves around a lot. With this, it's a simple grid format with clear images that represent that week's topic. And so it's when you think, okay, if we're doing a week on, I'll use gender performativity, for example, and they see an image that might represent that, it's easy for them to think, okay, that's the one I need to click. And the other key takeaway is that the ethical AI use needs to have continuous reinforcement. And indeed, it would be good to have continuity across the department and indeed the wider university. I know within the media department, we've developed wording for assessments around generative AI that everyone uses on their assessments. And I think if that could be continue into this kind of use, I think that would be really helpful as well. Some reflections. I mentioned at the start that, you know, I'm really interested in AI. Like, I'm also kind of terrified by it from an assessment perspective. And I had some assumptions. But first of all, my background was I was a filmmaker, and I used too many film examples. That was one of the bits of feedback that I got, and students wanted more diversity in their examples. So I started using Midjourney initially. It was called Midjourney Media. But catchphrase media, I started to introduce new ideas, video games, music, Irish media. Of course, if you're whatever discipline you're in, it could work to use your own examples within that. This is the thing that really surprised me, really expressed resilience to AI use in any form. And they just thought that it should have a complete blanket ban. We shouldn't even engage with it. And that's something that I did feed back to them, and it was an anonymous, but I fed it back to the whole group. And I thought it was an interesting insight into how a lot of them were feeling about it, but at the same time wanting to emphasize, look, this is a new technology that's not going to go away. And in this environment of media studies, we're going to have to understand it. And what I've done is I've integrated these questions around AI use and ethical AI use in my module evaluation surveys. So, I mean, I think I've had one round of that so far, and they've been overall positive. But in the future, I want to chart that progression to see how maybe students are changing their opinions. I don't know. It's very early on. And that's about it, essentially. And does anyone have any questions?